Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Society of Wetland Scientists webinar series. We're so glad that you can join us today. My name is Latoya Kasoon-Charles, and I am pleased to be the moderator for today's webinar. We are really excited to share an SWS e-learning experience during a time when many of us are looking for virtual opportunities to stay engaged and gain some continuing education credits. This webinar is one way to stay connected to the wetland community during the global pandemic, and we hope that everyone is doing well. Now, today's topic will be the ecology of Laguna Madre, a global treasure deep in the heart of Texas. And it is my distinct pleasure to introduce our speaker today, Loretta Battaglia, who I've known for quite some time, since grad school days. Battaglia grew up on a produce farm in Northeast Louisiana and learned to love wetlands and everything about the natural world at a young age. She received her BS in zoology and MS in biology from the University of Louisiana at Monroe. Her master's research on succession following abandonment of agriculture was the first of its kind to be conducted in floodplain wetlands. She then began her PhD work at the University of Georgia and the Savannah River Ecology Lab. Her doctoral research focused on hurricane disturbance effects and regeneration in bottomland hardwood forests. A postdoc opportunity arose at Louisiana State University when a proposal she had written to work on Chinese tallow invasion of wetlands in South Louisiana was funded by the National Park Service. It was here that she fell hard for coastal ecosystems and the wetland flora and fauna that lived there. After her postdoc, Battaglia took her first tenure track position at Southern Illinois University, where she worked for almost 19 years before moving to Corpus Christi, Texas, where she now serves as the director of the Center for Coastal Studies at Texas A&M University, Corpus Christi. So welcome, Loretta, and I'll let you take it from here.
Thanks very much, Latoya. And thanks everybody for inviting me. It's a real pleasure to be with you all here today. And with that, I think I'll get started with my slides. So as Latoya mentioned, I'm going to be talking today about the Laguna Madre, which is a system that I'm really just learning quite a bit about since I moved to Corpus Christi back in January. And I've made it one of my missions to acquaint people with the Laguna Madre and also hopefully to encourage people to come and do some work on this system, because it's a system that is not very well known, but it's also a magnificent wetland, marine terrestrial ecosystem that is deserving of a lot of study and research. Just a little bit about the kind of system that the Laguna Madre is. It's actually a hypersaline lagoon. And it turns out there are only 6 of these hypersaline lagoon systems in the world. Now, there are some hypersaline lakes like the Great Salt Lake, but here we're talking about coastal lagoons. And with the lagoons, only 6 of these in the world. So these are typically very shallow ecosystems, and they're hypersaline, meaning that the salinity within them is often higher than seawater that surrounds them. And in fact, it can be really, really high, upwards of 100 parts per thousand, depending on the conditions and the location. So as you might expect, there are a lot of extremophiles that occupy these systems, and the biodiversity that lives in these areas is very adapted to these kind of extreme salinity conditions. There's low rainfall, and so there's little opportunity for dilution of the hypersaline conditions. And also, typically there is little freshwater exchange and connection with the surrounding sea. So I want to just kind of zoom in here to coastal Texas and also northern coastal Mexico, where the Laguna Madre exists. The Laguna Madre really means mother lagoon. And it occupies part of South Texas on the coastal part of the Texas coast. Here you can see this skinny body of water here that wraps around the mainland and is bordered by this barrier island here. So this sliver of water is what I'm talking about here, the Laguna Madre. And it extends on into Mexico. So we can break it up into twin lagunas, if we like, and talk about the Laguna Madre of Texas and also the Laguna Madre of Tamaulipas, which is further south in Mexico. And if we want to be super technical, we can talk about the Rio Grande Delta, which forms a little bit of a bridge or an obstacle, depending on how you look at it, between the two lagunas. But collectively, overall, this system is the largest hypersaline lagoon in the world, with the South Texas part and down on into Mexico. It's a bar-built coastal lagoon, and as I said, it's bordered by barrier islands to the east and also the Texas and Mexico mainland to the west. It extends about 270, almost 280 miles from South Texas into Mexico. And being in Texas now, there are a lot of things that are kind of the largest in the world, like the Laguna Madre, but also Padre Island is the longest barrier island in the world. So we've really got some remarkable systems down here. In terms of salinity, it's variable and depends on rainfall. And we just are coming out of a very pronounced drought. And so the salinity levels have been pretty high in Laguna Madre over the last 8 or 9 months. But it can vary from 40 up to 80 parts per thousand. So it's truly a hypersaline system. It's also a negative estuary. And I had to really go back through my notes from wetland ecology back in graduate school days to recall what a negative estuary is. It turns out that this is a system where most of the water flow is actually in as opposed to out of the estuary. And so because of that, the water is relatively isolated within the lagoon, and it can take years for that water to flush through the system. And that makes it a really special system ecologically, but also very vulnerable to disturbances, including runoff and contaminants, because there's just not a lot of opportunity for flushing out of the salinity levels, as well as any kind of pollutants or contaminants that may enter the system. And I want to tell you a little bit about the vegetation that occurs here in this area, and also a little bit about the food web that exists in the Laguna Madre, because you may not be that familiar with it. I wasn't. And I'd also like to just familiarize everybody with some of the basic ecology of this area. This is a semi-arid climate. It can be really, really dry. And this year, like I said, it's been extremely dry because of the drought. But typically it's semi-arid, just under normal circumstances. So we get a blend of the more typical southeastern wetland flora with, some species that look a little bit more like they're from the desert. So we have salt and brackish marsh, as you might expect. And because we're pretty warm down here on the coast, it's favorable for mangrove establishment. And indeed, there's a mangrove gradient of abundance from the southernmost part of the Texas coast upwards to Galveston and a little bit north of there. We also have coastal prairies in some of the surrounding uplands and wetlands. And really, we have a very heterogeneous vegetation composed of wetland species as well as uplands. And here you can see in this picture here, some seagrass rack deposits and some of the salt marsh succulents poking up through that mat material. Here are some typical cordgrass or spartina stands mixed in with some betas. We do have a lot of salt marsh succulents. They're not endemic to here, but on the South Texas coast, they are they're much more dominant than we see in parts further east along the northern Gulf of Mexico. And here you can see kind of that blend of wetland and upland vegetation that I was talking about. Here's a couple of prickly pear cacti poking their head up through some of this coastal grassland. One of the other systems that we have here that's quite remarkable is we have one of the most extensive tidal and wind flat ecosystems, period. And these are very expansive, mostly unvegetated kinds of habitats, a lot of open sand, and they're very critical habitat for a lot of the birds, the water bird and shorebird species that we get here, including the protected piping plover, the reddish egret and snowy plover, to just mention just a few of the birds that use these systems. As I mentioned, we do have mangroves, and with climate warming, the mangroves are actually expanding throughout much of the Texas coast. Although there is an abundance gradient, we are seeing them creep farther northward and also expand out into the cordgrass stands that are dominated by spartina. So when the mangroves establish in those kinds of areas, as they grow, they typically will shade out the spartina and become the dominant vegetation type. However, even though it's warming, we are still seeing some extreme events like droughts, but also freeze events. And in fact, I'll talk a little bit more about the freeze event that happened here fairly recently and some of the implications of that. But we do have overlaying on this climate warming trend, we do have these extreme freeze events. And that's important from the mangrove perspective because they are very vulnerable to those. They can't tolerate extreme freeze events. And that's what limits their distribution to equatorial and subtropical kinds of areas. Whenever the freeze events happen, there is a concomitant dieback and mortality of the mangroves that can lead to erosion as well as land loss if they don't recover. In some cases, they do recover and they resprout vigorously, but in other areas, depending on the severity of the freeze, if it really killed a lot of the below ground biomass, then the recovery may be impeded for an indefinite period of time. And we're seeing some of that on the Texas Gulf Coast where the recovery really hasn't happened and those mangroves are starting to decompose. And as the roots rot, the sediment that they're holding on to is released and we can have pretty fast subsidence and coastal erosion. And we're talking about doing some restoration interventions where that might be warranted to limit subsidence not subsidence, but to limit coastal erosion and perhaps planting some spartina into some of the areas where the mangroves are not recovering. This is another kind of system that we have here that is unique. These algal mats are, I don't know if you can really see it. It's a little bit subtle, but there is a slight greenish, bluish hue to the top of this sand and mud material here. This is a tidal flat that has slight and periodic inundation. And so it's the perfect habitat for these algal mats to develop. We don't know a whole lot about the ecosystem role and how these algal mats function. They're very poorly understood. What we do know is that if we take a chunk of this material and look at it under the microscope and subject it to molecular analyses, that the mats are indeed composed of a mixture of cyanobacterial species. And so we know also that some of those species can do a lot of nitrogen fixation, but that's about as much as we know from an ecological perspective. And so this is an area that my group is looking at starting up some research projects to more fully tackle what kind of ecosystem functions these mats are performing. But they're really neat. Here we are taking a slice of the mats to bring back to rear in the growth chambers back in the laboratory. Switching a little bit into the more aquatic end of these systems, these are some of the other unique aspects of Laguna Madre. And I don't know how many of you have ever heard of serpulid worms. I had not before I started looking at this system that's right here in my new backyard. But these are worms that they're polychaete worms, and they are reef builders, and they've been around in this system for a long time, and they have created these reefs, some of which are really old reefs, but there's also some more modern reef building going on. And here you can see on the right one of the reefs with a couple of the worms poking their heads out through these tubes. They are tube-dwelling polychaetes, and they build these reef systems. And they're the only ones that occur in Texas, and they occur in an offshoot of the Laguna Madre called Baffin Bay. And here you can see at low tide, the reef material being exposed above the seawater. This is an area that is very popular for anglers because this provides a lot of really nice fish habitat. And but if you come down and do any fishing in Baffin Bay, you need to be careful because these reefs are submerged. And if you can't read the waters just right, you might have a boating accident. There have been quite a few boating accidents in Baffin Bay, collisions with these reefs. But they're really neat, unique aspects of this overall Laguna Madre system. I'm going to switch gears a little bit and talk about the food web and the main players in the food web. The producers, these are the ones that are photosynthesizing, that are fixing carbon. Well, surrounding the Laguna Madre is a lot of this terrestrial wetland vegetation, as I mentioned a little earlier. And here's a nice shot. You can see in this picture some of the tidal flats where the exposed sand, as well as some of the terrestrial and wetland vegetation. Here you can see a palmetto poking up through some of this coastal grassland, as well as the prickly pear cacti, which are really common around here. When you have just slight increases in elevation, you get this fantastic vegetation that looks very desert-like. Into the water, in the shallow waters of the Laguna, we often see very extensive seagrass meadows. And of course, this provides a lot of food as well as habitat for many aquatic organisms and at different stages in their life cycle. And I mentioned a little bit already the cyanobacterial mats, but oftentimes you can also see in the really shallow waters areas that are not necessarily the mats per se, but they're just conglomerates and mixtures of a whole bunch of different kinds of cyanobacteria as well as algae proper. This is just looking down into some of those shallow waters near our field station, and the different shades of blue and brown represent different species there. It's a really fantastic system. Moving into some of the consumers that live here, there is a very rich invertebrate community, very diverse. A lot of our biodiversity is within the invertebrate groups. We have shrimp, crabs, oysters, snails, you name it. Here you can see a little ghost crab. And in this picture, you can see this ghost shrimp. And the picture below it shows some of the burrows that the ghost shrimp has been using. I wanted to mention, we have a lot of snails like the periwinkle snail, the horn plicate snail. Lots of these species are prey for higher order consumers. And the oysters, we have, because this is a hypersaline system, you remember your oyster biology, oysters typically need a brackish kind of environment. If it's too fresh or if it's too salty, most of our Gulf oysters, for example, don't do too well in either of those extremes. But it turns out we have a saline adapted oyster that lives here in the Laguna Madre and does just fine. And they are trying to use that oyster to in their aquaculture endeavors to try and grow those up and make them more commercially available. So all kinds of organisms that are very adapted to these hypersaline conditions. With the fish, also a very rich and abundant fishery. People come down here from all over the place to fish. It's very popular. And one of the main fish species that really is critical because it feeds a lot of the higher order consumers that are like the game fish that everybody's after are the Texas mullet. And at times during certain times of the year when it's right for the mullet, they can form an almost continuous line or sheet of mullet fish across the Laguna Madre. I haven't seen them in their full glory, but I have seen some areas since I've been here where there's a very, very abundant mullet. They're pretty impressive. And again, they're eaten readily by a lot of the game fish such as trout, redfish, and flounder. But perhaps the most amazing part of this system, and I'm a plant ecologist who doesn't really know her birds very well, but I'm starting to learn because this is really a world-class birding area. And that's because it's really at the nexus of where there are a lot of resident birds as well as migratory birds. So here we are down on the Texas coast, and you can see that, you know, we're really close to a lot of those migration flyways. Here are a couple pictures that I took on some recent forays down into the Laguna. Any little strip of sand that's sticking out of the water is often just pelted with these birds coming and landing and poking around and scooping out invertebrates from the sand and foraging. And it's just an amazing birding kind of environment. And we have a lot of residents too. We also have the endangered whooping crane, at least at times of the year, will pass through this area. And here you can see the whooping cranes here on the left. There's a juvenile and its parent flying together. And we also have an area that's home to about 77% of the North American wintering redhead ducks. So a really important stopover location for a lot of species and really important species from a recreational standpoint as well as conservation. And we've got more. as you can tell, it's a very birdy area. In fact, there was recently, just a couple of weekends ago, a water birds conference that attracted people who do water bird research from all over the world, came here to Corpus Christi to have their conference and go on a lot of field trips. So if you're a bird person or just interested, it's really a place worth visiting for sure. This is a little bit of an overview that gives you a sense of how important the habitat is here for several threatened and endangered birds. These are the water birds and the reddish egret, for example, white-faced ibis, all threatened in the state of Texas, wood stork, brown pelican, red knot, endangered. That's their state status. And we have also raptors that have a either threatened or endangered status in the state of Texas, but we also have some federally endangered species too that use these systems, like the interior least tern. Piping plover is a real big one. So not only is this area really a fantastic place for lots and lots of birds and other biodiversity too, but it provides critical habitat for many species that are, their populations are threatened or endangered. And I want to talk just a little bit about some of the other consumers. It's easy to get carried away with the birds, but we also have a whole bunch of other species that are really neat here. So I grew up in wetlands in Louisiana, and most of my work has been on the northern Gulf Coast, and I'm quite used to looking out for cottonmouths and copperheads, which I love, snakes. But once I arrived here, I was told by several people, you need to get some snake chaps or some gators. And I said, well, okay. I mean, I keep an eye out for snakes. I respect them. I don't molest them or anything. I avoid them, but appreciate them. And they're like, no, you don't understand. This place is riddled with rattlesnakes. The western diamondback rattlesnake is one that's really common around here. And they live in a lot of the grassland and dune kind of environments. You see them a lot, for example, on Padre Island National Seashore, which is on that big long barrier island that frames the eastern part of the Laguna Madre. I haven't encountered any of the rattlesnakes yet myself, but I've certainly been stomping around in some of this habitat, and I've put in an order for some snake chaps because I think it's going to be important. They're really quite common here, and if this is more testament to how common they are, there is actually a rattlesnake vaccine that you can get for your dogs here at the veterinarian, at the local veterinarians. So they're abundant. The other thing we have here, even on the edges of town, and certainly along the Laguna Madre, are coyotes. And they don't often look that fluffy and healthy. Some of them look pretty scrappy. I don't know if they're just barely eking out an existence, but a lot of them look pretty spindly and scrappy, but they're very common. Very abundant. I've seen quite a few on the 5 or 6 trips I've been up and down the Laguna Madre. So they're pretty common, and they will go from island to island too. They can swim across or just walk across, in fact, the Laguna Madre, because it's quite shallow most of the time. And we also have ocelots. I haven't had the pleasure of seeing one of these yet, but I'm hoping to do that soon. They're pretty secretive, but they are there. In reptiles, sea turtles in particular are quite common. They use the Laguna Madre during different parts of their life cycle, and this includes Kemp's Ridley. And here you can see a couple pictures of Kemp's Ridley here nesting, and also one of the hatchlings. So some of the threats to Kemp's Ridley and other sea turtles include these extreme freeze events that I was talking about earlier, especially if they are in the Laguna Madre, because the water is so shallow. If there's a freeze event and they're sort of shocked by that freeze, it's very difficult for them to escape because the Laguna Madre is quite isolated. And so they can die there if they're not rescued, or the temperature warms up pretty quickly. So a lot of times people will go in and rescue them, move them into a rehab facility, and allow them to warm up a little bit, wait for the weather to change, and then they're released again. So that can be a threat. Habitat loss, I'll show you some pictures here soon when I talk about just general threats to the overall system. But just like with other wetlands and terrestrial environments, habitat loss is happening at an alarming rate with urban encroachment and development. Also, sea level rise is another important threat, because a lot of the habitat that they require is being inundated more frequently, and certainly that's the forecast for the future. And then with a lot of turtles, sea turtles in particular, you see propeller accidents like this mummified sea turtle that I found next to our field station. You can see the scars. I think it probably succumbed to an injury from a boat propeller. Especially in these very shallow habitats, it's difficult for them to dodge boats, and there's a lot of boat traffic in that area. So I want to talk a little bit about the threats to the system, and it's really no different from a lot of other wetlands that, we talk about a lot in SWS. It's a beautiful place down here. It's a retirement area. A lot of people settle here when they're retiring. It's also just a beautiful place here by the water, and we know that folks like to flock to the coast for vacations, or to have an extra vacation house, or just to live here. And we are seeing a very, very rapid growth in the Corpus Christi area. The population is expanding. And also there's a lot of development on Padre Island. It's a very attractive place for people to build. And so this is the kind of landscape that we're seeing more commonly here, unfortunately. Also, along with this, we have urban runoff, and even in some areas, like in the Baffin Bay watershed, I mentioned that had the serpulid reefs. That's an out pocket of the Laguna Madre. In that particular watershed, there is a real lack of modern waste treatment. So a lot of the waste treatment facilities are quite antiquated, and there's a lot of difficulties with rusting of those systems, and they're just not up to speed. And so we do have these events where the water quality declines rapidly, and that's a real serious problem, because that water quality issue doesn't get flushed out. It just kind of flows into the Laguna Madre, and we know that water in there is isolated and doesn't flush frequently. So those kind of water quality problems can stick around for a long period of time, and they're very, very vulnerable systems. So there's a lot of push toward trying to fix this up, but it's going to be an expensive fix, because the Baffin Bay watershed is, it's large, and so the level of the problem is great. Sea level rise, as I mentioned, we have about the average sea level rise that you would see along the rest of the Gulf Coast. Certainly not as rapid as Louisiana, but nevertheless, we do have it. And we have coastline retreat and all of the typical problems associated with sea level rise. We also have, really strong hurricanes that come through this area and produce very, very extensive storm surges that reach up into the inland portions of coastal Texas. And there have been a few in recent years that have done quite a bit of damage, not to Corpus Christi. We haven't had a direct hit in a long time, but some of our surrounding communities certainly have. So the forecast is, we will see more extreme hurricane events in the Gulf Coast, along the Gulf Coast. And so that's another threat to the system. But on the other hand, along with the threats, we also have a lot of positives. There is a great deal of attention and resources going into restoration of these habitats, and also in some cases creation of new habitats that mimic ones that have been lost. Here you can see, this is looking out into the Laguna Madre, and you see a lot of these islands, some of which are natural islands, some of which are ones that have been built from dredge material. And I should have mentioned earlier, along the middle of the Laguna Madre is the intracoastal waterway. And there is a lot of boat traffic, not just recreational, but also barges and, big boats that are moving containers are moving through this system. You might wonder, well, how does that happen when we're talking about a really shallow basin? You could see those birds running around through that water. Anytime you see birds standing like that, and they're just this far out of the water, you know that it's a really shallow system and you don't want to run your boat through there. Well, it is a shallow system. And so in order to keep that intracoastal waterway navigable, it is periodically dredged out, and it's just the very middle part of the channel. That's where the boats run. And so that dredge material has been used for habitat creation, and a lot of these little islands that you see here are from that dredge material, and can serve as wonderful habitat for lots of different birds and other organisms. There's also a very active oyster reef restoration program here that is spearheaded by several people in the Biological Sciences Department and the Hart Research Institute. And they're doing a lot of good work with reef restoration. Also, there is a new, relatively new program to encourage serpulid reef growth. And so that's kind of in its infancy, but one of our investigators at Hart is very active in trying to work out the best techniques to encourage serpulid reef growth. So that's an active and ongoing program. And then we also have tidal flat restoration. Again, these expansive open sand kinds of environments that are so important for a lot of our bird species for nesting, and also some of the turtle species too, the sea turtle, and in some cases the diamondback terrapin, which is a brackish marsh turtle. It's the only brackish marsh turtle. It uses a lot of, brackish marsh like juncus and some salt marsh habitat for forage, but it uses beaches, and particularly shell beaches, for doing its nesting. So it needs different kinds of habitats for different parts of its life cycle. So those tidal flats are going to be really, really important for a lot of species to complete their life cycles. And so the restoration is going to be very important. And not only is the tidal flat system imperiled by sea level rise and all the other development and other threats, but tire tracks are very common here in Texas. People are allowed to drive their vehicles up and down the beaches. And I think there's only really a couple beaches that are off limits, that are blocked off. And those are on Padre Island National Seashore. And it's not the entirety of the National Seashore. It's just a very, very sensitive portion of that that's blocked off. Otherwise, people run their vehicles up and down the beaches, and this produces a lot of ruts. And so it can really tear up some of those systems and critical habitat. So there is a new program that's just getting started to restore the tidal flats through inoculation cyanobacteria to try and build up some organic material and kind of fill in those tar tracks. But that's in its infancy. It's a recently funded EPA project. And then we're actually here at the port of Corpus Christi, which is an enormous port already, but it is being deepened and widened. The shipping channel is over the next year plus. Very, very soon this will happen. This will allow accommodation of larger ships closer into the port so that those ships can be more better policed during the exchange of materials. But what it also means is that there is a steady supply of dredge material from the port and from other projects in the vicinity. And so there's a lot of this material that can be used toward habitat creation and restoration. And they're really getting this program up and going. There's already some good projects out there, but they have many more in the planning stage to beneficially use this material. So I would like to say that there is a lot to be discovered here still. Basic biological discovery. There's been a lot of work done here, don't get me wrong, but much of it has been on the marine, the open water side of things. And as far as the wetlands and the associated terrestrial parts of the system, it hasn't really been that well researched. And so it's very exciting for me to be down here and growing this center and growing the lab to study these wetlands and to make this place really put it on the map, so to speak, so that everybody knows we have some incredible ecosystems down here. It's really a treasure from a national standpoint. Globally, it's one of only 6 hypersaline lagoons in the world. And it's not very well known, not just in pop culture, but it's not even really that well known with in wetland research. So I'm going to make it my mission to talk about the Laguna Madre as much as I can, and I hope you all will help me get the word out. And I'd like to extend an invitation for you to come and see us. We have this incredible field station. Here you can see it, the field station and the pier. It sits on one of those dredge islands along the Laguna Madre. And it is in a great spot for people to come and bring classes. You can bring your class and teach them there. It can hold up to 20 people, our field station. Here we have one of our staff at TAMUCC in a shrimp costume. We had a big shrimp boil here a couple of weeks ago, and we had over 90 people using the field station. But from a teaching standpoint, research and workshop and outreach, we can house up to 20 people for overnight, week-long stays. It's a really ideal place to come with your class, or come and do some research on the Laguna Madre, or hold a workshop. It's a great place to really immerse yourself in a beautiful system and forget about the distractions and work together with your group. And we also do a lot of outreach, education and outreach to the local community. And we have an artist in residence program, and we have kind of a rolling application process where people can apply. And if they want to come down to the field station and stay, typically it's about a week, bring their art supplies, do their art. And then afterwards we facilitate exhibits at the Corpus Christi Art Center. And then also here on campus, where artists can sell their art and really get the word out more about Laguna Madre and all of the inspiration that it provides. And I'd just like to say, as a testament to the fact that we really have basic discoveries left to do, this is a photo micrograph of the head of a mite. I had an old professor, well, he's not that old, but a professor who's retired now at University of Georgia, who works on microarthropods. And he said, "Hey, Loretta, grab me some of that rack material, near your field station and ship it to me, and I'll have a look and see what's in there. So I did. I sent him a bunch of samples, FedExed him overnight. He gets them, sticks them on a Berlese funnel, and starts, the little mites are falling, and other critters too, into the preservative, and then he identifies them. Well, it turns out there's a new species of mite here, unknown to science before that. And it was just from one little grab sample near the field station. So there's a lot that we need to understand and learn about this incredible system. And stay tuned. I hope you'll come and see us. If you want to get in touch, if you have questions after this webinar, you can ask questions now, but also if you want to get in touch with me and find out more about the Laguna Madre and this system, feel free to email me anytime. And with that, if I have time, I'll take questions. Thank you.
Awesome. Thank you, Loretta, for sharing the Laguna Madre with us. That was fantastic. What a cool system. Well, we're going to go to the Q&A now, and I will begin by posing questions from the Q&A. And so the most popular questions that have been upvoted, I'll read those first. And if the Q&A is over and you need to leave, anyone needs to leave, and they didn't get their question in, feel free to email Loretta at the email address on the screen. So we're going to get started. We've got a few questions in the Q&A here. What species of birds were in the video? I was wondering the same thing. There were so many of them.
Oh boy, I have to punt on that. As I said, I'm really not a bird person. I'm just starting to learn. But that's the thing. There were lots and lots of species, and there were lots and lots and lots of them. Some of the ones that I see routinely are a whole bunch of different tern species. We have a lot of we have brown and white pelicans. We have the plovers. Reddish egret is one that I've learned recently. I should have put this video in. It does this incredible sort of very awkward dance. If you've ever watched Seinfeld and watched Elaine Bennett's do her weird dance, this is kind of what the reddish egrets do. And they have a reddish head and sort of a brown body, but they also occur in a white morph condition. So sometimes they blend in with some of the more common white shorebirds. They're very common down on the Laguna Madre, especially this time of year. But that's really the best that I can do. There's a whole bunch of things in there, but you can go to that CBAP to their Facebook page and some of the material that they provide online, because they go into greater detail about a lot of the Laguna Madre. And also Padre Island National Seashore has a lot more information about the biodiversity of this system. And I can send you some of that if you want to reach out to me.
Alrighty, thank you. Another question, are there efforts to reduce or minimize all the vehicular traffic that's occurring on those beaches?
No, unfortunately, there's not. It was shocking to me when I first moved here to see that, because I've been on a lot of coastal dune, aquatic, terrestrial interface kind of places. That's where I like to do my work. And I'd never seen that before. I mean, they're basically kind of like highways. People just riding their trucks up and down the beach just fast. And I think it's one of those things that's allowed, and I'm not sure it would be politically palatable or feasible to undo that. The one little section that is off limits is over, like I said, on Padre Island National Seashore. It's very close to behind the visitor center, and they have ball yards on either side that block off traffic. But even sometimes people, at night will get in there and go around it. So it's a problem, but I don't know what the solution is.
Okay. I imagine there might be nesting of some of these birds on there, or even the turtles.
Yeah, there is, and that's one reason this one section is cordoned off, and protected. I think that there are pop-up signs during potentially really sensitive times of the year when there's a lot of nesting, but the beaches aren't, as far as I know, are not blocked off during those times. A couple of my students, my graduate students, are starting to work on diamondback terrapins that use shell beaches for their nesting. And one of the things that they have in their proposals is, there is a lot of education and outreach for people to understand what the requirements are for these organisms. My students are suggesting that we might want to have a campaign to put up signs on a more permanent basis and try to get the word out even more.
Okay. The other question, where are the other hypersaline lagoons?
So there's one system in Chile, as you might imagine, in the rain shadow, in the really arid part, that's where they develop. There's also a system in Australia. Again, arid environments are critical for development of these hypersaline systems. There's one somewhere on the continent of Africa, and I haven't found the exact location yet in some of my readings. There's a couple books on hypersaline lagoons of the world, but that's about all there is. It's not a very well put together literature. So yeah, North America, Australia, Africa, South America, and Chile, and I think I'm missing one. Sometimes people divide up the Laguna Madre and count it as two because we have the Texas side and we have the Mexico side. So it's depends on who's counting, but basically arid parts of the world are where they develop.
Okay, thank you. All right, any other questions? Come on, send them in here. I do have one question. You mentioned how the water that flows in just kind of stays there. It has really low flushing rates, and I was wondering if you were aware of any specific pollutants of concern that are in that lagoon.
Well, some of it's fecal material, like I mentioned, and you can get harmful algal blooms that pop up. In fact, harmful algal blooms are a real problem down here in the Laguna Madre and other estuarine systems along the Gulf Coast here. And they produce toxins that can, we've got red tides, brown tides. There's a lot of that kind of aspect to water quality in these areas. In terms of like inorganic contaminants, I'm really not sure. I'm gonna have to look that up. I'm not completely conversant with all of the contaminants. What gets the most press, at least now, is the lack of a modern sewage treatment system. Was there anything in the chat?
No, they're all really quiet.
Okay. Maybe I've inundated everybody with information or
Well,
can we, I don't know, there may have been some people who have already left, probably so, but
yeah.
Can we take any kind of poll or some kind of information as to how many people had heard of the Laguna Madre before today's seminar?
Let's see. Poll. Oh, there's a poll.
Whoa, you can do this on the fly, huh?
Oh, there we go.
I have to say that while people are taking it, if we have a few people still on the line, I had never heard of the Laguna Madre before I moved here in January. And given that our center operates the field station, that was one of the first things I did was visit down there at the field station. And it was just, I fell in love immediately. It's just an incredible area. I've had a couple of colleagues who are bird people who have come to visit to check it out because it's just amazing.
Yeah, it does look pretty cool. I will spread the word. I've never heard of it either.
Yeah, it is a spectacular place. And if you're in tech, we're pretty far down. It's a bit of a drive, but we do have an international airport here in Corpus Christi. And if you're looking for a place to come do some birding or camping or hiking around or canoeing, anything associated with the water and surroundings, it's a wonderful place to visit.
Yeah, a good spot for bird watching.
And plant watching too.
Yeah, of course.
We have those, we have the salicornias and the batis and the barrickia. All of those succulents are really, really abundant here. And the cordgrass, yeah, it's here, but it's not it's not the dominant. I don't know if they're going to take the poll.
Oh, yeah, I don't even know how it works. But a lot of people are saying they loved your presentation and thank you. And I agree. I second and third that.
Well, if people would like a copy of the presentation, they can reach out to Brenna and Latoya, and we can provide that to you all. Oh, I see something in the chat. Betas is good on a salad. Yes, it is. So is salicornia. And if you ever watch some of the trendy cooking shows, those species are actually being used a lot on salads. They're tasty, especially if you like salty things.
Nice. Well, I cannot see the poll results. Can you?
I can't. All I see is the yes, no. So,
okay.
7 out of 20 people responded had heard about it before today. 13 out of 20 had not heard about it.
You said 13 had not heard of
Yes.
it? Okay.
Correct.
Okay. Yeah, when I gave pretty much the same talk, although I changed it up a little bit for today, at the recent South Central chapter meeting, there were about 35 people there in the audience, and only 5 people raised their hand that they'd heard of the Laguna Madre. I asked the question before I got started with the talk. I just think it's just kind of it's this little treasure down here. It's actually a big treasure. And I would like to see it get a little bit more, time, especially at SWS. I think once the wetland people find out about it, folks will be coming down here to do all kinds of research and to check it out. I should say too that SWS had a national meeting or international meeting in Corpus Christi just several years ago, but I don't know if the Laguna Madre was one of the field trips.
Well, I was going to say you need to host a meeting.
Well, give it a couple more years once I get my feet on the ground, and then maybe since the international meeting was held here just recently, I think maybe it's a good spot for the South Central chapter meeting, but we could invite people from all over to come join us.
Yeah, that would be cool. Well, I don't see any other questions. So I think we can wrap up. And if anyone thinks of questions later, feel free to email Loretta. Well, we got to say thank you to our 2022 SWS webinar series sponsors. So thank you to the Whittington Group, WildNote, Delta Land Services, and In Situ. You can find their information at the websites listed above. Please visit, like, and follow our SWS webinar sponsors.
Thanks, everybody.
Yeah, and thank you so much, Loretta, for this wonderful presentation and for introducing us to the Laguna Madre. So next, our next Spanish language webinar will be on December 12th at 1 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. Join us for a presentation on the Central American waterbird count. And then our next English webinar will be on December 15th. And we'll learn about how drought is pushing Great Salt Lake to the brink. Check out our website and social media channels to learn more and register for upcoming events. And don't forget to complete the survey that will be sent out to you after this webinar to receive a certificate of participation and provide feedback on this webinar series. So thanks again, Loretta, really enjoyed it. And thank you to the audience for participating today. I hope you guys have a wonderful day and stay well and enjoy the Thanksgiving holiday that's coming up.